class. In this lecture, we are going to look at Latin American economics. So we're going to look at the economic and kind of social conditions because they're very much intertwined in Latin America from conquest up to about the Great Depression. So, all right. So, we're set that stage since conquest. So, as the Spanish and Portugal, they were colonizing, they were really changing the whole culture and lifestyle of the indigenous people in the Americas and then Latin America. And of course, the Spanish had more influence in North America. But we also see the way of life changing for the African slaves that were there. And we also see life changing for these Europeans that were immigrating to Latin America. And then of course, their offsprings were becoming a new kind of group subculture because they were now, Europeans that were born in Latin America. So you have all these different cultures coming together trying to create this new culture. Slavery was the key to sustainability for the colonizers. There were many revolutions that were going on from the 1700s to the 1800s. And really, when it comes to Latin America and even looking at the rest of the world, what we consider like developing nations or some of those Soviet controlled countries, even up until the 80s and 90s, we still see the effects of colonialism and we see these new nation states emerging and, a lot of conflict and there. It's just like development. I think in psychology, we have these different stages we go through in our life. And I think that when it comes to creating culture and these cultures, breaking off and gaining their independence, that it's a developmental thing too. And colonialism, imperialism, they monopolized so much of the world culture and the world economic system, since the beginning of like modern human history. And then even, if we go back into ancient times, trade has always been a key to contact among cultures and really kind of the key to evolution because it's through that contact that you learn different things and then you get these new ideas, new technologies, and so forth. So in the 1700s and 1800s we see a lot of revolution across the globe. This is when, we see slavery starting to, become an issue in the United States. And then, of course, in the 1800s, we have the Civil War in North America. And actually, slavery was abolished in Latin America and the Caribbeans before slaves in North America were given their freedom. Of course, there were still a lot of challenges. Like we said, now that we have all these different social classes, racial, ethnic groups coming together. We see these new nation states that begin to emerge. And so these begin to, places like Brazil, Peru, Colombia, Cuba, Venezuela. Brazil actually was one of the largest territories. And so, they had a very big slave population there and in forming their independence as a new nation state, they really had to address slavery and the rights of people. And of course, slaves were people too, of course. And so, why they were like, duh, slaves are people too. We have to worry about them. Blows my mind, right? But anyway, by the mid 1850s, we do start to see industrialization actually starts to take over. So by the 1850s in Brazil, they're starting to form their government so that there's a little bit of peace. The slave trade was coming to an end. Um, And they had a little economic turmoil there. They had some labor shortages. They really had to regroup the way that they were going to structure their social and kind of a commodity type economies, right? Because they had to accompany all these different groups. And so what we see with industrialization, for example, in Peru, they were going through some hard times. So the president there helped save them by getting rid of the loans they had to other countries, international loans. They started investing in railroads. Railroads were a big part of economic growth for Latin America, just like in North America during this time. And then we see different nation states going to war. We have Peru and Chile fighting with each other. We have Cuba, Brazil, Peru kind of going at it. And then, we also see the sugar boom in the 1700s. And so Cuba actually then became most important to the European colonizers at that time. We see a lot more sugar boom, mills being, excuse me, sugar mills booming up is what I was trying to say across the island there. And then, of course, that meant that they needed more slaves because they needed people to work those mills, right? And then, of course, Cuba was still in the hands of Spain at this time, although a lot of its neighbors they managed to um, free themselves. And then we see, Simon Bolivar, Bolivar, I think is how you say his name, Simon Bolivar, and Venezuela, he started the slave revolutions. I think I said his name wrong to another. I called him another name. I don't know if that was your guys' lecture or my other history class, but you guys, my apologies. And he led the way of the slave revolutions. And so then what do we see? We see modernization starting to take hold. And of course, we see for Latin America, they've had their ups and downs with modernization. So with modernization, we begin to see more um, reliance on exports to keep the economy going. And they were doing this more so than relying on their traditional forms of agriculture. But of course, as we see with Cuba and the sugar mills, they were still in exporting their goods. Um, well, right, yeah, they were exporting their goods, so it was more the import and those traditional agriculture and getting resources to the general people and the general public, especially people out in rural communities. There were a lot of hiccups there. All right, and so by the time we get to World War I, we see a lot of power readjustment in Latin America. And what we really see, the most significant event, is that Latin America cuts its economic ties with the rest of Europe. And so because most of the Latin American nations at this time, even though they kind of gained, most of them had gained their independence from that colonial control, they still had their hierarchy systems of government set up here in set up in Latin America. And so what that meant is that essentially Europeans living here, Europeans born here, they had these kind of dictatorships, and they had all the power and control. They owned all the land. And so by cutting those ties with America, it made those groups less powerful. All right. And so we see these struggles between the indigenous people, peasants, workers, elites, immigrants. And so, that sets a lot of that's really setting the stage for those social and political changes that we see in the 1920s. And then, of course, up into the Great Depression. And so by the time we get to World War I in Latin America, we see more of those non-elitist groups um, getting more of a voice when it comes to national politics, ethnic issues, and we have been the elitists, of course, are more on an authoritarian type side. So by the 1900s, authoritarianism, those style of fascist governments were really becoming popular all over the world. Of course, the ones that we may be most familiar with would be like Stalin, Hitler, of course, the most famous of those types of dictator. So in Latin America, they were going through these authoritarian type governments too. And by the time World War One ended, we seen that financial dominance by Europe over the region was pretty much ended. We see the destruction of the export markets to Europe, but what we see as Latin America is starting to get more of relationships with North America, which we at this time now is the United States. So the United States probably since they began, this is why they had isolationism and didn't want to get involved in World War One because they were fighting with the different areas of Latin America, and most importantly, they were fighting with the Spanish over, possession of the western part of the United States. During this time, we didn't have the western part of the we didn't have Mexico, or I'm not the world, but of the United States. That was controlled by the Spanish, and it was really very much still considered part of Latin America, right? But long story short, Spanish American War, in order to keep playing nice with each other, Mexico kind of gives all that land to the United States, and the United States promises not to like destroy everybody down in Latin America. Fair trade, right? And so then what else do we see? Oh, so even though World War One had economic consequences for Latin America, the Latin Americans they really didn't have any any what you would say dogs in the fight. And they didn't have an emotional connection to either side that was fighting during the war. And really, when it comes to World War II, they really didn't pick a side either. They were a little more isolated and then North America when it came to the wars. But we do see in the early part of the 1900s, we do see a lot of Europeans immigrating to Latin America. And so, once again, we see different social groups being made. Brazil was really the only one country that sided with the United States and declared war on Germany. Mexico, Argentina, they were still pretty mad at the United States. They thought them a bully, and they wanted to advocate for Latin America's neutrality. So they didn't want Latin America to get involved with World War One. But like I said, the Great War disrupted trade, it disrupted capital flow, and Germany became inaccessible, and then the Allied powers they were diverting their shipping elsewhere. So of course, that hit hard, and at the end of the day, though, exports soon recovery, and that was because war kind of created an economic boom for everybody because now you have to devote resources to those troops. And so for Latin America, they became important in that because they had a meat. They were sending meat to the Allied troops. And the import of that was scarce because all the factories in Europe they were devoted to war production. So that scarcity of meat drove up the prices for Latin America. And so we see that the disruption of war was only temporarily for Latin America. And, like I said, they kind of had this economic boom at the end there. And a lot of that was, like I just said, scarcity of products. It causes what, guys? Inflation. We're kind of going through that right now in America at this point in history, right? Here in 2022. And so we see that in Latin America. We see a demand and a good, demand for products. And so that causes inflation and prices skyrocket. A good example is in Cuba, where the price of sugar reached 23 cents per pound in 1920. And it was this peak because it only happened for a few months, because within a few months span, then it was back down to 3.5 cents a pound. And a lot of that had to do with European production of sugar starting to ramp back up. And they recreated that boom. Then we see that bust, and this is where Latin America is starting to really try to figure out how they become more, more um not important. What's the how their own products become more important to them, how they can focus on themselves and be a little more self reliant, so they're not having these periods of highs and lows and these uncertainties with their economy. So they see that their dependency on the world economy is becoming kind of hazardous. And so another example would be Brazil, when this it was trying to support the price of coffee, buying up surplus production, keeping it off the market. They first tried that in 1906, repeating it during this war, and then in the 1920s. And so, what they were doing is they were trying to create that little bit of monopoly. If they had all the products and then the rest of the world demanded them enough, then once again, you could charge whatever you wanted and people are going to buy it. Now, we have um, better laws and regulations put in place today so that companies aren't allowed to price gouge us so much. But during this time, those kind of things didn't exist. So they were trying to create these kind of price gouge. But even with these uncertainties and even with these hazards, overall, by the 1920s, Latin America was generally having economic growth and kind of a renewed optimism towards their futures. And of course, they were starting to get more foreign investment. Most of that came from the United States. And so they have these new capital flows coming into production activities. We see petroleum industry in places like Venezuela increasing. And then this also creates more financial stability for Latin America. So we start to see those type of financial institutions coming up, like ability to get loans and to pay off loans, and to deal with things like Wall Street. And then next we have economic depression. And so what we have to see, what we have to realize in Latin America, and I guess with any other culture that was colonized and gaining their independence, a lot of the economic issues, a lot of these kind of racial issues that they had, they were all interconnected. As European countries were losing control over these other these Latin, we'll just stick with Latin America, Latin American countries, people's lives were changing. We have these new groups forming, we have new voices being formed, and we also have people finding new ways to form culture. So this idea of nationalism, of having a culture, and Is all about being proud of your culture, but we see to the extreme, once again, Nazi Germany being the famous example there. All right, so by the time we get to the Great Depression started in the United States, but it was not isolated. The Great Depression was worldwide. It affected every country. And so, Latin America was not spared from that either because, once again, the biggest the biggest hiccup the Great Depression created was a gap in the trade commodities, the trade networks. Basically, no one had any money. They didn't really have anything to trade, and so because we've already became this global society and dependent upon each other, cutting that off, had profound economic um, effects, right? And so we see tariffs. The US starts raising tariffs on sugar. So in return, Latin America starts raising their own tariffs. We start seeing more restrictions on foreign trade. And so we also see domestic manufacturing. We see textile production increasing in places like Colombia and at a much faster rate than it did in England during the Industrial Revolution. And so, that, of course, has some downfalls for them. Mexico, we see iron and steel industry, and so they were able to survive because of that. And so for a lot of the Latin American countries, in order for them to save jobs for the native people, they numerous countries in Latin America, they adopted these measures that gave a percentage of the company's employees to the citizens. So kind of like think of it as a shareholder, but an actual fair shareholder type ship to where it's actually going out to the people. Kind of sounds a little kind of communist too, to where everybody was working, so everybody kind of got a piece of it, so that they were able to survive, feed themselves, and they were able to keep the businesses going. That actually doesn't sound like a bad thing, right? And then with the economic shocks delivered by the Depression and the two world wars, with, tilted economic policies after World War II, growing sense of nationalism. A lot of the Latin American countries, they still have these dictatorships. They still have these kind of extreme fascist or authoritarian governments. And so what we see is a reorientation of economic policies following too. And what we see is, Latin America, a lot of those countries, they felt like, terms of trade, investment, their economic interest, that when it came to Latin America, it was very unevenly disproportionate. So we could go with Argentinian economist Raul, I'm probably going to butcher his name, so sorry, Prebiche. I'm trying to say it French. It wouldn't be French. It would be Spanish. I'm not sure how to say it. So sorry, guys. But anyway, he thought that it was unbalanced, and the terms of trade, the economic conditions, how people were making money, that it was stacked in favor of the Europeans, the outsiders, because it's not just Europeans at this point now. Now we have North America, the United States, excuse me, involved. And so they reorientate their policies and try to improve the economic performance of their country. So that includes land reform, and so they want to eliminate underutilized land, and they tried to lessen the inequality of income distribution, because they felt that um, many Latin American cultures felt that inequality of income. God, I can't talk. I'm so sorry. Inequality of income distribution was a major obstacle holding back the growth of many economic their economic domestic market, their domestic market is what I'm trying to say there. All right, so due to those international turmoil caused by World War II and the Great Depression, several Latin American and Caribbean countries opted for insulating their economies from the fluctuations in the international market and the whims of developed countries. And so this is where we see the import into uh, industrialization. So we see those ISI, which import sustainability industrialization economic policies being implemented. And of course, those were supposed to increase domestic production, reduce external market dependency, and achieve economic growth and development for Latin America. And so basically, the strategy for the ISI was to domestically produce goods that they formerly imported. So things that they got from other countries, and they were just going to start making themselves, right? And so in doing that, we see like the beginning of industrialization now, as far as manufacturing goes. So we see these big factories and plants being built. And so this is when the government starts playing that crucial role. It wants to protect those infantile industries. It wants to subsidize companies. It wants to have those special exchange rates, encourage nationalization. So we see instruments or policies like tariffs, trade barriers, non-tariff barriers, and quotas that were used against the import competitors industry. And so basically they were restricting those imports. And they were using strict exchange rate control. And so like I said, trying to get this stuff there. And so besides those government subsidized methods and foreign companies that were, importing capital equipment for new industries, and special import exchange rates that were given to companies that imported industrial raw materials, fuels, and things like intermediate good. The government was also, and when I say government, I'm there. We're talking about some of these main countries: Peru, Argentina, Brazil, Colombia, and a lot of them were kind of following the same economic models. Just because I'm kind of lumping them all together and generalizing by saying Latin America, we have to remember that these are things going on in each of these different nation states at the time. And so when it comes to Latin America and the Caribbeans, we see the IS strategy work well during this time. And it was working because the world globe economic system had been devastated by World War II and the Great Depression. Excuse me. And so international trade hadn't really built itself back up, but we have new technologies and more emerging, and so that allowed Latin America and Caribbean countries to have economic growth. However, by the 1990s, we say the international market have recovered enough. Think about that. Wow. The Great Depression happened in the 1940s, and it's not until 50 years later that we say our economy has finally overcome that. Once again, this is where we can look at nation building, we can look at history as human development, I think even now at the state of the world, the state of each country, even in the United States, we're still very much in this kind of like not so much infancy phase, but kind of like an adolescent type teenager phase. And so, we see that in a lot around the world in these countries we call third world, we call developing nations, or we call them less developed nations. And, it's interesting to me because COVID and now the war in Russia has really changed. It's really changing the face of our global social and economic systems and how we engage each other. And, we don't hear so much about these other parts of the world anymore. Before COVID, there was a big, I feel like, definitely a big emphasis on the Middle East, but you still heard a lot about Africa. You still heard a lot about what was going on in Latin America. And it just seems like America has other interests right now, and the news are, focusing on other things that just don't really know what's going on with the rest of the world, I guess is what I'm trying to say. I just find it a little curious. And so, by the 1990s, we see countries in Latin America and the Caribbean starting to shift from those ISI to a new policy of market openness. And these new world tendencies and market pressures dictated a new direction for the Latin American countries' trade and economic policies. Um, and then consequently, we see the export oriented industrialization policy being implemented. All right then. And so by the time let's see, where are we? So yeah, so between the 80s and the 90s, we see those ISIs as that ISI policy. They weren't able to make Latin America or the Caribbean countries into self-suspicious, self-sufficient states. And so, like I said, then we get those export oriented strategies to help achieve economic growth and development. And so, what we see with the EOI, that export-led industrialization, export-led growth, is increased industrialization, and that's through the pressure of exporting goods with a comparative advantage. The difference there from the ISI policy is the role of the government. So the government was to provide those optimal macroeconomic conditions that will, lead to economic growth. So we see a lot of these nation states implementing policies to maintain economic stability, control things like inflation, restrict fiscal and monetary rules, avoid things like protectionism, and just generally maintain a friendly market environment to potentialize exports and direct more foreign investments. And then we also see how these export oriented policies differentiated from that ISI policy when it comes to the private sector. We see more efficiency when it comes to the allocation of resources. And what we mean by that is that, these nation states are investing more in themselves. So things like infrastructure, building up their own country. Dogs, stop barking. Building up their own infrastructure. We see, like we said, we see more attraction of foreign investment. Of course, now some of that has been detrimental to Latin America because there have been a lot of environmental damages to some of those foreign investments, such as, the destruction that is going on in the rainforest. And we see Sorry about that, guys. Dog barking up there. So we see more attracting foreign investors. Um, And oh, I was saying how that has been detrimental to the environment, and that's really been bad for some of these countries too, because this is where we see things like not a lot of labor laws, not a lot of environmental restrictions. So we see kind of cricket governments that are letting these foreign companies come into their country and pretty much destroy it and use the people because they're making money off of it. And so, that's definitely something that Latin America is still struggling with to this day and trying to learn how to, adjust and change. Like I said, I think, independently as countries and cultures globally, we are all in this transitional stage, and I think it's just part of development. It, for these humans living in this. All right, so finally, guys, in Latin America, as we see in the rest of the world, World War II, once it was ended, there were a lot of expectations to economic development and democratic consolidation, across the world, especially in Latin America. The Nazis were considered, the most evil, heinous group of all times, and they were going to take over the world and really enslave people like people have never enslaved before. And so, World War II, by the Nazis being overturned, there was now this rhetoric that the world had been saved from evil. And just like with the end of World War I, people were optimistic that peace was going to take over. However, Russia and the United States get into it, and we have the Cold War. And of course, the Cold War has a lot of detrimental effects on Latin America because during the Cold War, a lot of countries in Latin America, a lot of leaders were used by both the United States and the Soviet Union. And that had a lot of consequences for just the people. And so that's why we see so much turmoil and poverty and these drug cartels and human trafficking coming out of Latin America. And that's also why we see so many poor people trying to get out of Latin America and trying to cross the border, come into the United States. And so when it comes to the economic side of Latin America, we see growth. It's, of course, though, in Latin America, there's a slower rate of economic growth than in Europe or places like East Asia. There's a world decline in production and trade, and then there's a gap in personal income per capita. We see industrial democracies increasing. We also see more education, more mass media, more mass culture. And so, in light of that, these economic conditions that are going on in these different Latin American cultures. There's more exposure with mass media. And so there's a lot of feeding of just the general people's dissatisfaction with the way things are going. And we see military dictatorships, revolutions, but then no, none of those were really truly successful. And then, like I said, that puts us right there in the Cold War and the ways that the United States and the Soviet Union were using these Latin American countries, really had devastating effects, like I just said, that we are seeing today. So, all right, guys, that wraps up our lecture this week. Remember, you can reach out to me for anything. Oh, I forgot to put this on the slide, but let me go ahead and address this. Um, Rating feedback turnaround. So for your discussions, that will always be 72 hours. So by Wednesday, midnight Wednesday, you will always have your discussion grades and feedback posted. Any assignments that are due during the week are due within 5 days. So you will always see feedback and grades for your assignments by no later than midnight Friday. I will post announcements when those feedback and grades are in the grade book each week so that you guys are aware of that. Make sure you're getting in your discussions and participation in our discussion forums. Remember, those are important parts of our classroom environment. Make sure you're including those APA elements as support. A good rule of thumb is to always include at least one citation per paragraph. And then, of course, you want to have that full source information listed in APA in the reference at the end of your post, or as the last page to any assignments that you would have. So all right, guys, that wraps up our lecture. ECU in the discussions. And like I said, reach out for anything. Thanks. Bye.